Good morning. Last week, we started exploring who we are as a church. See, as we step into our next season, I know there are some folks in this room who might be feeling really excited about that. You might be so hopeful for where you see DCC going in our future together, and you might be ready to just take off running. And I know there's others in this room, maybe myself included, who also kind of cautiously step into this next season because there's something really beautiful about who we've always been. And we want to hold on to that. We want to hold on to the best parts of this church as we continue to move forward into the next thing that God is calling us to, so that we can represent the healthiest version of ourselves that we can be. So we're taking a little bit of time to reflect on who we've always been as a church and where we think that might be leading us in this next season. Last week, I said that one of the things DCC has always been is a distinctly Christian community. I assured you that wasn't because we have a well-polished belief statement on our webpage that you can go to get all the right answers. I also assured you I am not working on crafting such a beliefs page. I told you that the Big C Church is not distinctly Christian because we hold some kind of moral superiority. We actually looked at many of the times when the Big C Church has gotten it wrong. Instead, we talked about being distinctly Christian as a call into the cloud of witnesses, as the writer of Hebrews talks about it, of people who are not perfectly following Jesus, but those who persevere in following Jesus and believe that Jesus is actually bringing us to maturity. All of us as a community, as a church, as the body of Christ, we are being made mature. This week, I want to talk about something that I think is a close cousin to this idea of distinctly Christian. I want to talk about a phrase that we say quite a bit here. I want to talk about what it means to hold unity over uniformity. Now, originally we started talking about unity over uniformity when we became an LGBTQ inclusive church. We realized that our leadership had been wrestling with this idea and with our text for about 2 years before we brought this to the rest of our congregation and said, we think this is the direction we need to move. We realized that we were inviting you into a conversation and we genuinely wanted to hear your voices in the process. This idea of unity over uniformity is a really beautiful one. On a personal level, I know that I have had some church experiences where there was a very strict list of beliefs that I needed to sign off on in order to belong. And the more I wrestled with the text myself, the more I had a hard time signing off on a big, long list because I actually came to more questions than answers. And so when I came to DCC, there was something extremely healing and hopeful about being able to be in a room with people who acknowledge tensions, who can sit alongside folks who maybe don't think exactly like they think, maybe don't vote exactly like they vote, that we would have neighbors in our own community that would offer not just an echo chamber, but challenge when I needed it. There was a lot of freedom in this idea of unity over uniformity, and I think that freedom is something we need to hold to as we move into our next season. But I think there's also something deeper to this idea of unity over uniformity that we're being called to. This morning, we're going to open our text to 1 Corinthians, starting in chapter 12, and we'll be at verse 12 and moving through 27. If you don't have a Bible, you'll find one underneath one of the seats in front of you or around you, and the page number on the screen behind me is going to correspond to those Bibles. Now, before we read this text, I want to ground us a little bit in what's happening in this letter that the Apostle Paul has sent to the church in Corinth. See, in the previous chapter, Paul has been confronting the church about their practice of Eucharist. In the early church, Eucharist was not just a small piece of bread dipped in wine or juice. It was a shared meal. Everyone brought what they had to the table, and they shared with one another in a context that had a very wide economic disparity. And what had started to happen in the church in Corinth is those who had more wealth, more privilege, literally more food to bring to this meal, were able to show up early because they didn't work in the types of jobs that those who were not in the top 1% did. So they started to show up early, and they started to feast. And they feasted until there was nothing left. And then, when those other 99% showed up to the meal, they had nothing. And so Paul has been confronting this idea, and this is where we pick up chapter 12, starting in verse 12. Just as a body, through one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slaves or free, and we were all given one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? And as it is, there are many parts but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unrepresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is part of it. I don't know about you, but for me, this text was often taught as a lesson on our spiritual gifts, that each one of us here owes to the church that we bring our spiritual gifts to the rest of the body. And while I think in part this is what Paul is saying, I think actually in the context of the passage, there's something else Paul is doing here. I think Paul is talking about our need to value one another, to honor one another. And he's particularly confronting this idea of the Eucharist in the early church. And what makes this metaphor particularly potent for his first hearers is that Paul's actually not the first person to talk about this body metaphor. See, Seneca, who would have been a Stoic philosopher who wrote around the same time as Paul, also used this metaphor of the body. Only for Seneca, the body wasn't about equity, it wasn't about dignity, it was about duty. For Seneca, he reinforced that all of the parts of the body need to just stay in their lane, do their thing, don't question the status quo. We uphold power because that's what makes the body work. We need inequity for things to move forward. So he wanted them to continue to quietly tick along as whatever part of the body they were. And Seneca, too, is not the first person to use this metaphor of the body. This metaphor was actually one steeped into the imagination of a Roman society. At the time of Jesus, there was a man named Titus Livius, his nickname Livy, and no, I did not come up with that myself. Livy wrote a history of Rome. And in Livy's history of Rome, there's one part where he talks about the patricians, the top 1 or 2%ers, and the plebeians. And he tells this story where the plebeians at some point get tired of the patricians taking all of the power and hoarding at the top. So the plebeians stage a major walkout. And what the consul of Rome decides to do is to send one of their former leaders, Menenius, and Menenius tells the plebeians a parable. And the parable goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was a body. And all the parts of the body started to get very frustrated with the stomach, because it seemed like all the stomach did was sit around and eat and gorge itself on food. So the parts of the body decided they would stop feeding the stomach and see what happened. And Menenius goes on to say that as the body starved the stomach, they started to weaken too. They too started to starve. And while on the one hand it feels like he's teaching a story of unity, the point of this parable is actually stay in your lane, maintain the status quo. Those at the top are actually what keeps us all functioning, so don't question it. Just do your job. And so I can imagine, as Paul's writing this letter to the church in Corinth, as those who held the most power start reading this letter and they go, oh, here is the metaphor of the body. I can imagine that they think that Paul is about to double down. Paul is about to affirm that they need to maintain their power, that nobody should question their power because they're obviously the ones that keep the church going. And then Paul flips this on its head. He says, actually, those members that you're considering the least, you should consider the most. When one of you suffers, you all suffer. This would have been actually an incredibly surprising way to use this metaphor for Paul's early church. And as I think about us, as I think about the Big C church, as I think about some of the movements that we have been through in our own time, I'm not sure it's food that determines who has power and who doesn't, so much as it's been ideas. Thanks to the scientific revolution, we had the rise of what we call modernism. Modernism was a little obsessed with finding absolute truth, the right answer. This is ultimately, in the church, what gave rise to fundamentalism. And we, like Paul's early church, are not immune to being influenced by all the things that are happening in the culture around us. We, like the early church, didn't stand as a prophetic witness against what was happening in the world. We joined it. We reflected it. This is common. So at its worst, we ended up at fundamentalism. Obviously, many of us in the room have experienced all the ways that doesn't work. We started to question things. We found that sometimes the answers weren't as right as we thought they were. I'm somebody who grew up in the era where I was taught that Pluto was a planet, and then all of a sudden Pluto wasn't a planet. So when you taught me absolute truth, did you mean it or not? And so we started to do this overcorrection, right? We went from modernism, that there is an absolute truth and we definitely know what it is, to saying something more like, your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. We ended up in postmodernism. What this ultimately was a rejection that those at the top maybe don't have all the right answers. We started to level the playing field by saying, my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth. There's no power in that dynamic. But also, there's no absolute truth, except for the one that says, there is no absolute truth. Naturally, there's a little bit of a tension and a problem with that. Where we've actually landed now is something called metamodernism. And metamodernism is sort of the correction of these two extremes. It's not, there's an absolute truth and those at the top absolutely know what it is. And it's not, there is no absolute truth, so your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. It's something more like, there is an absolute truth, we're just not sure who has it. And from here, we've started to search for the truth in the margins, as well as in those who have power. What I'm saying is we've started to search for this more in the whole body, not just in part. We've started to search for this in the stories that make up the body of Christ. We might call this the imago Dei, or the image of God. which we find in all the parts of the body, all the pieces. I think about my own journey in Christianity, and often those people who are the most different from me, those people who are the most complicated for me, and sometimes the most frustrating, are the people in which I have learned the most from. Because it's in great suffering and in great love that we are truly formed. And I think that's true in our relationships also. So what does that mean for a place like DCC? What does it mean that we're at this place searching for the truth, not just at the top, but also throughout the entire body? I think for one, it's not just that we're looking for the truth in ideas that are well crafted and beautifully put together. We're also looking for the truth in a more embodied sense. We want to experience the gospel in the lives of those people who are around us. I think there's something actually really hopeful about metamodernism for the Big C church. I think it's an opportunity for us to look to the places where Jesus has always moved. I mean, think about Jesus' own ministry. In first century Palestine, he lived in an extremely divided world. And everybody had a different idea about how they were going to fix that. You had those like Matthew, one of his disciples, who was a tax collector. He looked around at the world around him and he thought, there's no sense in beating Rome, so I'll join them. Now, to his own people, that made him a traitor. But Jesus called him anyways. Then we had Peter and possibly Judas, who were zealots. The only way to solve this issue with Rome, this conflict, is to overthrow them, and probably violently. These two sat at the same table. And then you had the Pharisees, which, by the way, Jesus was probably a Pharisee. This is the group that scholars think that Jesus fit most cleanly within, and yet it was the group he was certainly most critical of. He never gave any illusion that they had it all figured out. And while many Pharisees, who thought that if they could just call the people back to living purely, just doing the right thing, maybe this moral superiority, they would once again be put back in power by God, it seems they too didn't have all the answers, particularly because what we see Jesus doing is asking more questions than offering answers. And then we had the Sadducees. The Sadducees thought, well, if we partner with Rome, then we can at least keep control over the temple system. And it's all these people and everybody in between that Jesus seems to call to the same table. And it's not that they come out with these clean ideas about the right answer. It's that they live embodied with one another. They recognize that they belong to each other. They care for one another. And when they ask Jesus, who has power in the kingdom, he says the least of you does. The one who's not striving for power is the one who has it. What does it look like to be the kind of church that will sit in stories? Even those that maybe make us uncomfortable? What is it like to be embodied with one another? This can be hard. Because it's one thing to show up at a room, sit here together, and know that people don't believe exactly like I do. It's another thing to invite that person to dinner at my house. And when that person says something that I think is crazy, or when they tell me a part of their story that makes me uncomfortable, how do I love them like Jesus loved all those people around his own table? How do I not use my own privilege to shut that person down? And more than that, how do I learn from them? Because it's one thing to practice tolerance. It's another thing to practice mutuality with one another. We're not called to be a church that tolerates one another. We're called to be a church that learns from one another. that considers ourselves as something like the pinky toe of the body, that's just showing up to learn from those around us, from the stories of how Jesus is showing up. We say here that we are exploring and participating in the life of Jesus so that we can be a healing presence in the world. Explore is sometimes the easiest part of this for me. It's easy for me to have a lot of ideas up here and think I have it all figured out. What's harder is for me to participate. For me to recognize that in order to be healing in the world, I need to be healed by all of you. And chiefly, those of you that are challenging to me need to be the people that heal me, that challenge me, that show me the blind spots in my own story that don't quite look like the body of Christ yet. So this invitation towards being the body of Christ is something more like that opportunity that metamodernism offers us, an embodied gospel. We're going to turn to the Eucharist in a minute. But one of the things that was hitting me as I was studying this passage, as I was thinking about what it means for us to practice unity over uniformity, is something that we say when we come to the Eucharist table. We often say here that everybody is welcome. It's not my table, it's Jesus' table. And there's something about that that doesn't quite feel right. It's not just that everybody is welcome, it's that everybody is needed. We're not allowing something. We're recognizing that we actually need every person in this room. And it's tempting when we start talking about power and we start talking about control to decide that those who have always had a seat at the table suddenly don't anymore. It's easy to be mad at those people. It's easy to say, you've eaten your fill, move over. But that's actually not what Jesus calls us to. That's actually not the picture that Paul presents here. Paul doesn't say, move over, get out of my way. He's proposing a longer table, one that we all participate in. So as we come to the Eucharist table today, I want us to think about coming not with this sense of a permission. We're allowing everyone to come. I want us to come to the table recognizing that we need everyone to come. We need the whole body to come. In order to understand what the image of Christ is in this church, we need all the parts to show up, to bring their full selves, to be vulnerable, to share with all the other parts of the body. And we need to learn from one another. When Jesus was sitting with his disciples and preparing to share this Eucharist meal, he says this to them. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." As you are ready, I invite you to come forward and participate in this table. And as you do that, I want you to think about what you have to bring to this table. What is it that you have that we need, that you are showing up vulnerably for? And also, who is it at the table that you need to be learning from? Who is it that has a story and an experience so wildly different from yours that you can learn something about who Jesus is and what it's like to embody his presence? As you're ready, I invite you to come.